When I was 9, my family moved to a quiet stretch of wooded land just outside of Boise, Idaho. The property had been a steal for my parents, a sprawling 2 acres of land that backed up to even more forest. My parents were thrilled about the deal. My younger sister loved the idea of playing in the woods, and I was enchanted by the giant oak tree in the backyard, its thick branches stretching out like the arms of a giant. But the tree wasn't the only thing that caught my attention. At the heart of its massive trunk, about 15 feet above the ground, sat a treehouse. It wasn't fancy, just a little wooden box with a slanted roof and a single window, but it had a certain charm. My dad said it looked like something out of an old childhood adventure movie, and he wasn't wrong. The treehouse quickly became mine. It felt like a castle, a refuge, a secret hiding spot all rolled into one. I spent hours up there after school, reading books, sketching, or just staring out at the endless rows of trees. For the first few weeks, it felt like magic. But that feeling didn't last. The first time I noticed something was wrong, it was subtle. I'd been sitting cross-legged on the treehouse floor, flipping through a sketchpad, when I felt a draft. It was strange because the treehouse was pretty well sealed. My dad had patched up the walls and roof before I started using it. The air felt cold and sharp, and it carried the faintest smell of something earthy, like wet moss. I glanced up, expecting to see the window open, but it wasn't. That's when I noticed it, a piece of string tied to one of the beams. It was thick, frayed at the ends, and tied into a strange, elaborate knot. I hadn't put it there, and neither had my dad or my sister. It didn't seem like something my parents would have ignored when they'd fixed up the space. I climbed down the ladder, leaving the string behind, and mentioned it at dinner. My dad brushed it off, saying it was probably just some old junk left by the previous owners, but I couldn't shake the odd feeling it gave me. A week later, the strings multiplied. I climbed up one afternoon to find not one, but 3 pieces of string tied to different beams. Each had the same intricate knot, loops and twists that looked almost purposeful, like they were meant to be symbols. The air inside the treehouse was colder than ever, even though it was the middle of June. I had a sense, a deep, gut-churning feeling, that I wasn't alone up there. I climbed down without touching the strings, my pulse racing. That night I couldn't sleep. The treehouse felt too close, too present, its silhouette visible through the gap in my bedroom curtains. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing inside, looking down at me. The tapping started the next day. It was faint at first, just a light knock on the tree trunk, like the sound of a branch swaying in the wind. But there wasn't any wind. I was reading in the living room when I heard it, rhythmic and deliberate. Tap. 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 It stopped as soon as I opened the back door and stepped outside. I told my dad, but he chalked it up to squirrels. "It's an old tree," he said. "There's probably a whole family of them living up there." I wanted to believe him, but something about the sound didn't sit right with me. It wasn't random. It was too steady, too measured. That evening, curiosity got the better of me. I climbed back up to the treehouse with a flashlight, determined to prove to myself that nothing was wrong. The strings were still there, swaying slightly as if something had disturbed them. And then I saw the marks. They were faint, scratched into the wooden floor, but they formed a pattern. Triangles, circles, and lines intersecting in ways that made no sense to me. My flashlight flickered, the beam dancing across the walls, and I swear I saw something move in the corner of the room, a shadow where there shouldn't have been one. I scrambled down the ladder, nearly twisting my ankle as I hit the ground. I didn't tell my parents this time. I knew they wouldn't believe me. But I didn't go back to the treehouse for days. When I finally did, it was because of the note. It appeared on my bedroom windowsill, a single sheet of lined paper with scrawled writing that I didn't recognize. "Come back. You're part of the story now." My stomach dropped. I didn't want to believe it was real, but the paper felt cold to the touch, damp like it had been left outside for hours. Against every ounce of reason, I climbed back to the treehouse that afternoon. The strings were gone. The marks on the floor were faint, almost invisible. But there was something new, a small wooden box sitting in the corner. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but I stepped closer and opened it. Inside was a photograph. It was old, yellowed at the edges, and it showed a group of kids sitting in the treehouse. They were smiling, but their eyes looked wrong, too wide, too dark. And behind them, barely visible in the window, was a figure. A tall figure, with long, thin limbs and a face obscured by shadows. That night, the tapping came back. This time, it wasn't on the tree. It was on my bedroom window. I froze, my heart pounding as I stared at the glass. A face was pressed against it, pale and featureless, its mouth moving as if it were speaking, but no sound came through. I screamed, and the figure vanished. My parents rushed in, but there was nothing outside. The next morning, I begged my dad to tear the treehouse down. He didn't understand, but he could see how scared I was, and he agreed. It took 2 days to demolish the treehouse. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched, like the woods were alive and angry. When the treehouse was finally gone, I felt a weight lift off my chest. But the relief didn't last. The tapping followed me. Even now, years later, I hear it sometimes, on my bedroom window, on the walls of my apartment, on the doors of places I thought were safe. It's always the same rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. And when I hear it, I know it's waiting for me to come back. Growing up in a small town in Washington state, my childhood wasn't particularly remarkable. My family lived in a modest 2-story house at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, bordered by a dense forest that stretched as far as the eye could see. My younger brother, Ethan, and I spent most of our summers exploring the woods, building forts, and pretending we were adventurers. But the true centerpiece of our little wilderness was the treehouse. Our dad had built it for us when we were kids. It was nothing extravagant, just a single room with a slanted roof, a few windows, and a sturdy ladder leading up from the base of a tall cedar tree. We decorated it with old blankets, a couple of beanbag chairs, and a wooden chest that we called the vault, where we kept our treasures, comic books, trading cards, and an old flashlight that barely worked. It was our kingdom, a place where the rules of the outside world didn't apply. For years, the treehouse was our refuge, a place where Ethan and I could escape homework, chores, and the monotony of small-town life. But one summer, something changed. That was the summer I stopped feeling safe in the treehouse. The summer I learned there are places in the world that don't belong to us, no matter how hard we try to claim them. It started with the whispers. Ethan and I had gone up to the treehouse one afternoon, armed with snacks and a new stack of comics. The sun was high, the air warm and humid, and the woods buzzed with the sounds of summer, cicadas droning, birds chirping, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. We were halfway through a comic when we heard it, a faint, hushed sound that seemed to come from the walls. At first, I thought it was just the wind slipping through the gaps in the wooden planks, but Ethan frowned. "Do you hear that?" he asked, lowering his comic. "Hear what?" I said, though I already knew what he meant. "It sounds like talking," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We both went silent, straining to listen. The sound was faint, almost too faint to hear, but it was there, a soft murmur, like someone whispering just out of earshot. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to make out the words, but they were garbled, indistinct. "Probably just the wind," I said, trying to convince myself more than him. Ethan nodded, but his expression was uneasy. We stayed a little while longer, but neither of us could focus on our comics. The whispers didn't stop. Over the next few days, the whispers grew louder. What started as faint murmurs became clearer, almost conversational, though the words were still impossible to understand. Sometimes they sounded like laughter, high-pitched and childlike, but not quite right. Ethan was the first to suggest that the treehouse might be haunted. I laughed it off, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that he might be right. There was something unnatural about the sounds, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. One evening, just before sunset, I climbed up to the treehouse alone. I told myself I was just going to grab a book I'd left behind, but part of me wanted to see if the whispers were still there. As soon as I stepped inside, the air felt different, heavier, colder, despite the warm summer evening. The whispers started immediately. This time, they weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from the chest. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The vault was an old wooden chest with brass hinges, its surface worn smooth from years of use. We'd never kept anything strange in it, just our usual junk, but now it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. The whispers grew louder as I stepped closer, my hands trembling. Slowly, I lifted the lid. Inside was nothing but our usual clutter: comic books, a flashlight, a deck of cards. But nestled between them was something I didn't recognize, a small, carved wooden figure. It was roughly hewn, about 6 inches tall, and shaped like a person, though its features were crude and distorted. Its eyes were hollow, empty sockets, and its mouth was an open slit, as if it were screaming. I reached out to touch it, but the whispers stopped abruptly, plunging the treehouse into silence. The sudden quiet was worse than the sound. I slammed the lid shut and scrambled down the ladder, leaving the treehouse behind. That night I didn't sleep. The next day, Ethan convinced me to go back up. He'd heard about the wooden figure from me and wanted to see it for himself. I tried to tell him it was a bad idea, but he wouldn't let it go. We climbed up together, the morning light filtering through the trees. The treehouse looked normal, almost peaceful, but I couldn't shake the sense of dread that clung to me. The whispers started again as soon as we opened the chest. Ethan picked up the figure, turning it over in his hands. "What is this?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "I don't know," I said. "I didn't put it there." The figure felt wrong in his hands, like it was watching us. Ethan tossed it back into the chest, and the whispers stopped again, replaced by a faint scratching sound. "What's that?" he asked, his voice shaky. The scratching grew louder, coming from beneath the floorboards. It sounded like something trying to claw its way up. We bolted, nearly falling down the ladder in our rush to get out. That night, the scratching came back. This time, it wasn't in the treehouse. It was in the walls of the house. I woke to the sound of it, faint but insistent, like nails scraping against wood. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and glanced at the window. For a moment I thought I saw something outside, a shadowy figure, watching me from the edge of the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The final straw came a few days later. Ethan and I decided to go back to the treehouse one last time, to get rid of the wooden figure. We climbed up in silence, our flashlights casting long shadows in the dim interior. The chest was still there, the whispers louder than ever. Ethan opened the lid, and the figure was gone. In its place was a photograph. It was old and faded, the edges curling with age. It showed 2 children sitting in the treehouse, their faces blurred and indistinct. But behind them, in the shadows, was a figure. Tall, thin, and faceless. We ran. My dad took the treehouse down the next week. He didn't believe our story, but he was tired of our fear. As the boards came down, I swear I heard the whispers one last time, faint and mocking, before they faded into silence. Even now, years later, I still hear them sometimes, when I'm alone, when the house is quiet. And I wonder if the treehouse is really gone, or if it's just waiting for someone else to find it. When I was 12, my family moved to a small, wooded town in Vermont. My parents had always wanted to live somewhere quieter, far away from the noise of the city, and they jumped at the chance to buy an old farmhouse on a few acres of land. The property backed up to a dense forest that seemed to stretch on forever, and to my surprise, hidden among the trees, was a treehouse. It wasn't the kind of ramshackle fort you'd expect to find in the woods. This treehouse was old but sturdy, with a solid frame and a roof that only sagged a little in the middle. A single window overlooked the forest, and a ladder, its wood splintered and worn, led up to a trapdoor. It didn't look like anyone had used it in years. I asked my dad about it, and he said the treehouse had been there long before we bought the place. The previous owners hadn't mentioned it, and he figured it was just an old relic from another family's past. He gave me permission to explore it as long as I was careful. That was all the encouragement I needed. The first time I climbed the ladder, I noticed something strange. The wood was worn smooth, like it had been used recently, even though the rest of the treehouse was covered in a thin layer of dust. At the top, the trapdoor creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and the interior came into view. The room was small, just big enough for a kid to sit cross-legged or lie down. The walls were lined with crude carvings, names, initials, and random shapes etched into the wood. But one carving stood out. Near the trapdoor, someone had scratched a warning into the floorboards. "Don't stay after dark." I laughed nervously, brushing it off as an old joke or a way to scare younger kids. Still, the word stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, the treehouse became my favorite spot. I'd climb up after school, bringing books, snacks, or my sketch pad, and spend hours there, listening to the sounds of the forest. But no matter how much time I spent there, I couldn't shake the feeling that the treehouse didn't entirely belong to me. It was subtle at first, the way the shadows seemed darker than they should have been, the way the air felt colder inside even on warm days. And then there was the ladder. One afternoon, as I was climbing up, I noticed something unusual. One of the rungs was slick, as if someone had just stepped on it with wet shoes. I frowned, wiping it with my hand, but the moisture didn't seem to be water. It felt thicker, like sap or something else. Something sticky. When I reached the top, the trapdoor was already open. I was sure I'd closed it the day before, but I told myself I must have forgotten. Inside, everything looked the same, except for one thing. In the corner of the room, someone had left a single, mud-covered footprint. I ran straight to my dad, but he dismissed it, saying it was probably just an animal. "You're in the woods, buddy," he said. "Raccoons, squirrels, they get everywhere." But deep down, I knew better. That footprint wasn't from an animal. It was from a person. The next day, I climbed up with a new sense of unease. I checked every corner of the treehouse, looking for more signs of an intruder, but found nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, and might come back. As I sat there, trying to distract myself with a book, I heard something. Footsteps. At first, they were faint, blending in with the rustle of leaves and the chirping of birds. But as I listened, they grew louder, more distinct. Someone, or something, was walking through the woods. I froze, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped just below the treehouse. I leaned over, peering through the trapdoor, but saw nothing. The ladder was empty, the forest silent. I waited for what felt like hours before climbing down, my heart pounding with every step. When I reached the bottom, I saw them, prints in the dirt, leading from the forest to the base of the ladder, and then disappearing back into the trees. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind against the windows, made me jump. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But when I finally drifted off, I dreamed of the ladder. In the dream, someone was climbing it. Their face was shadowed, their limbs impossibly long, their movements jerky and unnatural. They didn't stop at the trapdoor. They kept climbing, higher and higher, until they reached the sky. The next day, I decided to stay out of the treehouse. I focused on chores, homework, and anything else that would keep my mind off the woods. But by evening, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out, determined to prove to myself that there was nothing to be afraid of. The forest was quiet as I approached the treehouse, the only sound the crunch of leaves underfoot. The ladder looked normal, but as I climbed, I felt an odd sensation, like the rungs were warmer than they should have been, as if someone had just used them. When I opened the trapdoor, the air inside was freezing, despite the summer night. And then I saw it, a new carving on the wall, fresh and jagged, as if it had been made minutes ago. "Go away." The whispers started that night. They were faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. At first, I thought they were coming from outside, carried by the wind. But as the night wore on, I realized they were closer, inside the house. I lay in bed, clutching my blanket, as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't words, exactly, just a low, murmuring sound that filled the room. When I couldn't take it anymore, I turned on the light. Standing by the window was a figure. It was tall, its outline sharp against the moonlight. Its face was pale, almost featureless, and its eyes, if they were eyes, were hollow and dark. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stared at me. I screamed, and the figure vanished, dissolving into the shadows. My parents rushed in, but when I tried to explain, they didn't believe me. They said it was a nightmare, that I was imagining things. But I knew what I saw. The next morning, I went back to the treehouse one last time. I didn't want to, but something compelled me, like I had to finish what had been started. Inside, the air was colder than ever, and the whispers were louder, more distinct. They seemed to come from everywhere, the walls, the floor, the ceiling. And then I saw it. The ladder. It was inside the treehouse, propped against the far wall, its rungs slick with that same sticky substance. But this time, the substance wasn't sap. It was red. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the house, but I begged my dad to tear the treehouse down. He finally agreed, if only to put my fears to rest. The next day, it was gone, reduced to a pile of splintered wood and rusted nails. But the whispers didn't stop. Even now, years later, I still hear them sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet. And when I close my eyes, I see the ladder, stretching higher and higher, reaching for something I'll never understand.